Hello, and welcome to the Director's Cut. I'm delighted to be in conversation with Marco Daniel, the director of the Joan Miro Foundation in Barcelona, one of the first contemporary art museums in Spain. The foundation opened in 1975 to the public in a building designed by Josep Luis Sert, a close friend of Miro, and it's a wonderful example of how the collaboration between the artist and the architect enable the space to respond to the artworks. Many of us in India would be able to connect to Sert, since he was a disciple of Le Corbusier, the architect who designed the city of Chandigarh. Marco Daniel took over at the foundation in 2018, just before the pandemic, steering it through one of the toughest times for all institutions and ensuring it has remained a dynamic center in which Joan Miro's work coexists with cutting-edge contemporary art. Marco is an expert on Chinese and Catalan contemporary art. Earlier, he had a teaching career for over 10 years at the Winchester School of Art before he joined Tate Modern in 2006 as curator of public programs. A few years later, this responsibility was extended to both sites in London, Tate Modern and Tate Britain, where he was convener of public programming. Amongst other projects, Marco was co-curator of the exhibition Joan Miro, The Ladder of Escape, that first opened at Tate Modern in 2011, and then traveled to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, and finally to the Miro Foundation. Marco and I have a long association that goes back many years when I went on a fellowship to the Tate Modern. And it's wonderful to be back in conversation with you, Marco. So welcome to the Director's Cut. We have a
Hello.
We have a more detailed bio in the chat box that you can look up, and we also have time for questions at the end. So type them in on the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screens. I would also like to thank Renuka and Saurabh for the ISL interpretation during our conversation. So Marco, let's start at the beginning. You were born in Germany, an academician who specialized in Chinese art, and now leading an institution dedicated to the work of one of Spain and Catalonia's most influential artists of the 20th century. So tell us about how this relationship with Miro and his work developed. I suspect it had something to do with the exhibition that you co-curated at Tate, but let's hear from you.
Hello, Kamini, and hello to everybody who's watching now. It's a real pleasure and an honor for me to be here and to be able to talk about my work and my career. And I'm now in a phase of my career where I can look back really onto many years of work, and where it all seems to make perfect sense. Makes perfect sense why I'm here now, but only with hindsight. And so if I go back to the beginning of my years as a student, and then my initial career as an academic, as a teacher, I would never have imagined that I would end up being a director of the Miro Foundation. But actually, as you've already pointed out, it does make sense. It did start really not just with the exhibition, The Ladder of Escape, but earlier than that, when I was researching my PhD on a cultural property in the Spanish Civil War. Okay. And that research led to my participation in an exhibition when I just started my PhD, actually, which was at the Hayward Gallery, and then went to Barcelona, and then to the Deutsches Historisches Museum, the German Historical Museum in Berlin, which was about art and power. And it looked at Europe during the period of dictatorships from 1930 to the end of the Second World War in 1945. And for that project, I worked on Spain, because that so closely coincided with research for my PhD. And so that, in a way, is was when I first got into close contact with many of the artists that then subsequently occupied such an important place in my life. In fact, the Miro exhibition at Tate Modern really came about because of that previous research that I'd done. And I was really fortunate to be able to work on that great exhibition with my colleague Matthew Gale at Tate Modern, and to spend more than 3 years working in depth on Joan Miro. So bringing together all these different elements that had already occupied me in my PhD research, but more specifically now looking at Miro's life. And in Miro's life at the pardon me, at the relationship between Miro's life and society. The different social and geopolitical events that Miro experienced. Miro lived through 8 decades of the 20th century and experienced the First World War, the Paris of the 1920s as the one of the capitals of world art, the Spanish Civil War, the Second World War, the Franco regime and dictatorship. And so he really lived in a very troubled 20th century and experienced firsthand many terrible things, which he transformed in his art into images that have really shaped the history of the 20th century, of painting and sculpture in the 20th century. And so that was a really fascinating opportunity for me. And while I was working on the exhibition for Tate, in which for the first time we explored directly the relationship between Miro and politics throughout his life, that also became the occasion on which I became deeply acquainted with the Miro Foundation here in Barcelona itself. And it was the occasion also that led me to recognize in this institution here a really fascinating museum, one that is more than just a single artist museum, but one that also has a very active program in terms of modern and contemporary art. And so that's how I ended up here. When the director's role became available, I presented myself, and I was fortunate enough to get it.
Actually, there are so many wonderful points that you brought up in this introduction, really, to the museum and to what you and your links to it, Marco, but I'm going to return to them later in the discussion. And I really want to begin with the whole architecture of the building.
Yes.
Because I was completely fascinated by it. And it sort of really reveals this relationship between cutting edge art and cutting edge architecture. I remember you walking us through it, showing us how Miro really wanted it to reflect the Mediterranean origins of his art and the nature of what he was doing. Do you want to tell us a bit about it?
Yes, this is really interesting. And if you permit, I will begin with a small anecdote, because the way, same way that I said that life tends to make more sense when you look at it backwards. Similar things happened to Miro when he was a young artist in 1918. He was 25 years old. He had a solo exhibition in the most important commercial gallery for contemporary art in Barcelona at the time. And that exhibition, of which he was immensely proud, was a complete and utter failure. Yeah. He didn't sell a single work, and the critics were not very positive about what he was doing. So at that point, as a young man, he wrote that he would never exhibit in Barcelona ever again. And between 1918 and 1968, when he was 75 years old, so really for his entire adult working life, he did not have any public exhibitions in Barcelona. And in 1968, for his 75th birthday, a retrospective was organized, which he accepted. And the experience was really quite positive. At the same time, while he was at the exhibition, and you have to remember this was still the Franco dictatorship. So on the day of the opening, at the last minute, he was told that a government official would come to open the exhibition. And so he phoned up and said he had a headache, he couldn't come, because he didn't want to be there together with representatives of a regime that he did not like, that he did not support. But at the exhibition, a group of young architects said to him that they liked the exhibition, but that they thought that his art was much more radical than what one could see in this retrospective. And so they proposed to him to do an exhibition of the other Miro. And this exhibition, literally called The Other Miro, was organized by 4 young architects in a small space and was incredibly different, really avant-garde. Miro painted a 40-meter-long mural on the glass facade of the building, which he then performatively destroyed after the exhibition. So he really engaged with other practices. And it was after this double whammy, this double event of an official retrospective and a much more avant-garde intervention in the city center with young people, that he decided that he wanted to give 4 gifts to the city. And they were 3 large public artworks: the mural at the airport in Barcelona, a mosaic on the floor of the Ramblas, the main pedestrian street in Barcelona, a large public sculpture in one of the parks, and the 4th gift was going to be the Miro Foundation. And so he himself gave the foundation to the city. The city offered him a space in which to put this museum. And they offered him a medieval palace near the current location of the Picasso Museum in the Gothic quarter of the city, really in the old town. And Miro said, "Thank you, this is very generous, but I do not want a Gothic building in this part of town. I grew up in this part of town where the streets are so narrow that I never saw the sun. My art needs air, light, and nature." So he said, "I want to be in a situation that's in a park overlooking the city, surrounded by nature, and in a modern building, especially in a modern building." And he already knew that he wanted to work with the architect Josep Lluís Sert. Josep Lluís Sert had also been the architect of the Spanish pavilion at the 1937 World's Fair, where Miro and Sert had already collaborated. So this was in 1937. This was 30 plus years before the building of the Miro Foundation. And subsequent to that, in the 1950s, Miro had asked Sert to design his first purpose-built studio in Palma de Mallorca, where he had settled at that point. And then 10 years later, Sert worked with Miro on the design of the Fondation Maagd, Maeght, in the south of France. And this foundation was also one where Sert designed the building and Miro designed a series of public sculptures for the gardens of this museum. And then a few years later, Sert and Miro collaborated again. And this is really the crowning glory of their collaboration as artist and architect when they designed the Miro Foundation here. At this point, Sert was based at Harvard in the United States, where he was the dean of the School of Design, in which the architecture department sat. And Sert, as a left-wing architect, did not have a license to operate in Spain under the Franco dictatorship. So Sert worked with a young local architect who was the head of works for him during the building of the project. And so Sert and Miro were in the unfortunate position of not being able to talk to each other regularly. They were obliged to send each other letters. And for us, of course, this is a great gift, because we now have the entire conversation in writing on record. And so we can see how Miro engaged actively in the design of the building. And so, for example, there is a beautiful courtyard that looks over the city and over the park. And Miro wrote onto the plan in a handwritten annotation, here we need a terrace where visitors can relax. They will already have spent an hour walking through the museum. They will be tired of art. They need fresh air, nature, and views. And he thought, and at this point, that this was a place of rest where visitors could sit down and write a postcard. And in a way, if we think about it from our perspective today, this means this was the social media spot. This is where you sit down and you do your Instagram post, or you post on a TikTok video. You know, it's really this interaction of the visitor with the museum. For him, this was very important. But there are also very precise interventions that Miro made. So, for example, we have to remember that the start of this building project was in around 1969, 1970. The building opened in 1975. So when the building was first designed, Miro and Sert included specific architectural spaces, like a U-shaped niche, a small chapel, specifically for one triptych called Painting on White Background for the Cell of a Solitary Person. So this painting had its own chapel built for it in the new building. But then Miro and Sert did something really interesting. Symmetrically to this chapel, past an entrance to a side gallery, they put a second chapel of the same dimensions, for which no painting existed yet. But Miro said that he would paint one for that space. So there was a real dialogue where the building was built around some of the works of art, and where Miro painted works specifically for the building. And one of the things that was really important for them was not just this attention to the experience of the visitor, that you walk through the space and that you have places where you can sit and relax, but also that the building had windows, big windows that let in light, daylight, and that allowed you to see the outside. So while you're inside the building, you have the works of art inside the building enter into a relationship with the landscape and the gardens outside the building. And this is also part of this shared philosophy. This is something which, of course, would have been completely impossible in the old town. In the old town, any window gives out directly onto the facade of another building.
Another building, yeah.
So that sense of openness, which was so important for Miro and for Sert, is something which means that for me, even after now 6 years of being director here, coming into our building every morning is an uplifting experience.
Absolutely. I
Really
remember the
wonderful.
quote here, Marco, and what sometimes we need artists to tell us museum professionals what our audiences really need.
Yes.
And yeah, the modern materials and details that make the building such an important work of 20th century art, but they're also threatening it, right? Because I remember the water had begun to penetrate the roof and skylights.
Yes.
The reinforcement bars are rusting.
Yes.
Some of the
Yes.
beautiful sheets of glass have
Yes.
cracked. So how do you now
Yes.
overcome difficulties intrinsic to the very structure?
Yes, that is such a good question, and it's really important, I think, for us as people who work in museums to also be honest about this. It's having a beautiful building like this is a visual delight and a headache. There's no question about it. We just this spring beginning a 3-year-long project to look after the reinforced concrete of the outside shell. As you say, this really is necessary. From an engineering perspective, concrete is not a solid but a sponge. It's full of tiny little air pockets, pores, which absorb anything that they come into contact with, whether that is contaminants in the air or quite simply rain. So we need to protect the building. We need to protect this outer shell. And as a really radical rationalist building, the outer shell is also the inner shell. It's not one of those buildings which has, an outside and then on the inside a completely different treatment of materials. But the concrete shell out of which the building is constructed determines both the external facade and the internal wall surfaces. So that means that we really have to look after the building. We have to make sure that the concrete is in good condition. And that really means that we have to spend a considerable amount of fundraising efforts to get support for looking after this building. I mentioned before that the building was opened in 1975. 1975 was also the year of General Franco's death. So when the building first opened, Franco was still alive, and then very soon after, the transition to democracy began. And in fact, quite recently, when I was at the museum, at the ministry in Madrid that looks after architecture, the person responsible for architecture used this wonderful phrase that I have absorbed since that meeting, which is that the Miro Foundation is one of the key examples of architecture of democracy. It's an architecture that, for the values that I explained, purely in reference to art, openness, transparency, windows, light, nature, those values are also related really to this transition to democracy in Spain after the death of Franco. So the ministry has recognized our building as a key building in the history of 20th century architecture. So we've managed to get support for our maintenance and refurbishment project of the concrete, But I think that only answers part of your question. Can you remind me what the other elements were?
No, it was really about how do you actually overcome difficulties intrinsic to the structure. So
yes.
So
you're right. There are other elements, and I think this is also something interesting, perhaps mainly for really technical reasons. But of course, the tendency in museums over the last 50 years, really during the lifetime of the Miro Foundation, has been for conservation to lead, really even on a museum design, which means that modern museums tend to be built with very few or no windows at all in the exhibition spaces. You maximize wall space and you reduce light exposure. You have light through a tightly controlled electric lighting. And the CERT building does not have that. The CERT building is open. It's also open internally. We really have, once you get into the building, there are no internal doors between coming into the building, going through the galleries, going into the temporary exhibitions, going into the restaurant, going into the bookshop. There's not a single door, internal doorway. So that means that in terms of climate control, we need to be really sophisticated in terms of controlling climate in the galleries. And of course, that is one of our challenges. We have very good climate control in the galleries, so that there are natural transitions from the more tightly controlled gallery spaces to the more public spaces where climate control is not quite so significant. Also, we have doors that take you out onto terraces everywhere. So yes, it does require a lot of technical attention. And then, of course, we have both the gift and the challenge of these really beautifully sculpted spaces inside the galleries. It's I think testament to the quality of the building that all artists who come to work in the galleries are infused and excited by that opportunity. We've never had anybody say, the architecture is too prominent. We can't work in this, It really is because Serge was a rationalist architect, but also a humanist. So there is an attention to the human scale in the spaces, in the proportions, and all of that makes it really interesting.
Absolutely. Well, next year is a landmark year for the foundation, the 50th anniversary. And I'm sure there's a huge amount of planning going into the celebrations. But Marco, we would love to be given a peek into the central idea around which you would construct this, or if there is any other way you are thinking of celebrating this very special moment in the institution's history.
Thank you. Yes, this is going to be a big moment for us. 50 years of the Miro Foundation. And because the foundation opened originally in June 75, but without an official opening acts because of the political regime, we have a period of exactly 12 months from June 2025, which is when there was the soft opening of the Miro Foundation, to June 2026, when there was when it's 50 years since the official opening of the foundation. So in that year, we're planning a number of different key phases. The first phase is quite simply to celebrate everything that the Miro Foundation has achieved in this time. And we want to bring into that the voices of artists and of ordinary people and ordinary visitors to the foundation, to hear from them about what the Miro Foundation has meant to them. The second major, we are going to do that in an exhibition that brings together many different elements around this theme. In the second part, in the autumn of next year, we're going to have a large exhibition that repositions Miro's work in relation to the work of younger artists, particularly the shifting of the art world from Paris, where Miro had his first exposure to the international avant-garde, to New York. He visited New York 9 times in his life, which makes the United States the second most visited country for him. And so we're going to explore all the different artists with whom he entered into contact while he was there. That will be our second major exhibition. It will be really interesting, and I hope you can make it. I hope all of you can make it.
I look forward to that. Yeah.
And then the third phase will be that we want to celebrate the building and the building's relationship with our environment, the park, the urban park, and the urban landscape, the city of Barcelona. And at the same time, also the Miro Foundation's relationship with contemporary art. During the second half of our celebrations, we will be opening the next edition of the Joan Miro Prize exhibition.
That's wonderful. Okay, this is the favorite part of the program that I love most, when we really ask you to walk us through 5 works in your collection that speak to you. So let's just go ahead with that first before we come back to all these connections that you talked about with Miro.
Yes. I thought for everybody, it would be really useful to see what it is that I've been talking about, which is that the Miro Foundation is this quite beautiful white concrete building inside a park on a hillside overlooking the city, with views to the sea and over the city. And you can also see here how this building has these light wells that bring daylight into all the different galleries and exhibition spaces. But maybe we can go to the next slide, and I can talk about these paintings. These are the burnt canvases. You can clearly see 3 and just about make out that there's a 4th burnt canvas through one of the holes in the vertical canvas that is hanging front left. Underneath the red figure, between the red figure and the yellow horizontal line, there's a hole, and you can see the cross of the stretcher of another canvas that's behind it. Miro painted 5 of these burnt canvases at a point when he was 81 years old. And he did this for one of the last major exhibitions that he had in his lifetime in Paris, at this point, at the Grand Palais. And what I love about these works is that they show an artist who at the age of 81 had every right in the world to say, I've done enough. I can rest on my laurels. And he decided that he wanted for that exhibition, which included over 300 works, that half of them would be new works. So this incredible energy and drive that he had as an artist. And so he made a series of 5 canvases. They're all the same size, for which he painted, cut, slashed, burnt, and trampled these images. And one of the things here was obviously that he was very much in tune with things that other younger artists were doing. Say, for example, the auto-destructive art movement, artists like Matter, who were cutting canvases, all the young artists around you. He's saying, okay, this is really interesting. Let me see what I can do with that. But there was also another dimension to this. And this is really important. This is something that we always want to show when we show these works. For Miro, the sense that a painting hangs on a wall was really very reductive. The sense of a painting that hangs on a wall, that offers a picture onto another world, an imaginary world, for him was only part of the story. For him, the work of art was also a physical object. So the partial destruction of the painting makes it really clear that we're dealing here not just with a surface, an image on a surface, but with a constructed object a material object, but also, and I think this is the other dimension that I think is really important, it was an object through which you could see, and by looking through it, you were inevitably reminded of the fact that when we are looking at art, we are in the world and we are part of the world, and the art that we're looking at is part of this world. And the art that we are looking at needs to be able to communicate to us a relationship to our world, to the world we live in. And for me, this is one of the series of works for Miro in which this becomes absolutely crystal clear.
No.
Let me go to the next work. Here we have, actually, it's not a work by Miro, but it's something that I think is really important to know about the Miro Foundation, which is that the Miro Foundation was the first museum in Spain to have an education department. And for us, ever since the day we were founded, the relationship with young people has been tremendously important. The relationship we have with kids, with families, with young people, really is one of the motors of everything we do. And every year in the autumn, we take part in a festival in which we carry out activities related to drawing. Drawing, of course, was one of the key techniques that Miro used. In our archive, we have more than 16,000 works on paper that Miro left us, that are all his drawings, his sketchbooks, his notes, etc. And we want to make that relationship between your mind and the world really clear through these activities in which we invite young people to come to us and to collectively, in this case, engage in the drawing of a large collaborative work. So this relationship that we have to our audiences is really important. The participation that young people have in everything we do.
I remember coming there, Marco, and seeing another exhibition that you all had done for children, yes. And it, oh my God, it was just tremendous.
Yes,
it was playful. It taught them something, and there was such a level of interaction as well. It was quite moving.
Yes, thank you very much for that. It's something that we always seek out, you know, the ways in which we can make sure. I think many of us perhaps remember being taken to museums by our parents or by schools, and perhaps even being bored, you know, and that's entirely legitimate, because if you don't make art interesting, if you don't offer a way into the experience of art, then we are missing one of the greatest opportunities we have. It's one of our responsibilities as people who work in museums to make sure that the art that we so strongly believe in becomes accessible and available to all our audiences, and that we help everybody develop their own creativity. Can we have the next image, please? This was an exhibition by a local, very young artist in our project space. Spy 13, Space 13 is our project space, and Lara Fuchsa used really traditional techniques of hand-blown glass making to make these objects, which she then filled, in this case, with sump oil, the used oil that is extracted from lorries and cars. So she created these beautiful craft objects. She learned glass blowing from an old master in Mallorca, where she is from, and then combined this to create these really delicate but also very powerful works of art that again show this relationship between both the traditions that make up our lives and the contemporary discourses. You know, this was part of a cycle of exhibition called A Monster Who Tells the Truth. You know, this relationship between the beautiful and the ugly. And maybe we move on to the next image as well. And here we have another part of our programming. So the first image showed the collection of Joan Miro. The second image, our commitment to working with young audiences and to the public program and the more the learning side of the work that we have in the museum. The next image then had been about the work that we do with emerging artists, both local and international. And this is the artist from the previous Joan Miro Prize. We gave the prize to Nalini Malani, an artist we chose simply on the strength of her work. We were then subsequently absolutely astonished when in her acceptance speech, when she came here to Barcelona, the first thing she said is that when she was a very young student, she got a scholarship to go to Paris, and she met Joan Miro. And so we said, we give this award, the Joan Miro Prize, to an artist for the quality of the work, but she remembers from her own life when she was a very young person, just starting out on her career, how her contact and her meeting with Joan Miro had been really significant for her. And for us, this is also a really important reminder that when we deal with art of the 20th century, with art by artists who are dead, art by white male artists who are dead, that doesn't necessarily mean that they no longer mean anything to us. And I think for me, that was so interesting and so revealing how Nalini explained to us how that encounter really also helped her develop her path as an artist. Obviously, it was a brief encounter. She didn't study with Miro or anything, but just this contact, you know, just passing through the same space on one occasion, you know. I think how you remember things like that and how they are significant for you. And of course, Nalini did a really beautiful exhibition with us. Here, I would like to bring out one other element, which is not something that we always talk about. But of course, making exhibitions is really expensive. And doing exhibitions that are based on complex, multi-work, audiovisual, sometimes kinetic installations, sometimes with very delicate works like Nalini's work, can be prohibitively expensive. But Nalini was so generous with us and worked with us to choose works that are already in Europe. And I think this is really important for us because as institutions, we also need to think about the world we live in. And that is not just the big questions of politics and the economy, but also the climate crisis, the climate catastrophe, and how all these movements of work and shipments across the globe have an impact for which we have a responsibility. So this is also my opportunity to say thank you again to Nalini for working with us, not just on producing a really beautiful exhibition, but also on helping us to be a little bit more sustainable in the work that we do.
Yeah, she's an amazing artist, Marco, and I've worked with her. But I think the important point you're making is these connections that people, so many of our artists traveled. And there is so much they picked up, even, you know, going into Paris and looking at other work. And it changed so much or influenced so many of their ideas and thoughts.
Yes, that's absolutely right. So I think for an artist like Nalini Malani, who, when you look at her work to a European audience, clearly has very broad references. And to understand that for her, the references to Greek mythology, the history of Western art are as important as references to traditions that are perhaps more local to her own origins is really important. And I think the way in which artists allow us to be transported and to experience the richness and diversity of human existence, that's really one of the most amazing things that we have in art, and thanks to artists.
Yeah.
Let me go on to the next one, because we have here another part of our work. We did a really beautiful exhibition on Paul Klee and the secrets of nature. When we were working with the Paul Klee Center in Bern in Switzerland, we thought, what aspect of his work should we look at? And we focused on nature, again, because that is such a strong point of contact with Miro. So we created a solo exhibition of Paul Klee, but quite simply, the selection of works and the references to nature in his work suggested to our visitors a connection also with similar elements in the work of Joan Miro. It was very interesting because people said, I can see why you chose Paul Klee, because there are so many similarities with Miro. We never talked about the similarities. They were quite simply there for the visitor to see. And this image in particular that I've shown is the participatory space in which we had assembled a number of natural objects, pine cones, seeds, from local trees for children to experiment with, to assemble sculptures out of, to draw, to paint, and to interact with, to also create that sense that art, even when it's just a drawing on a piece of paper or oil on canvas, has this connection to our tangible real world. And it was really wonderful to see kids play in that space. And that actually takes me to the next work as well, which is one of the really most stunning works we have in the foundation, is the large tapestry of the Miro Foundation. This is a work you can see it's huge. It's more than 6 meters high, and it's one of the spaces to which children come, and they invariably do what we see 3 children doing here on the left of the image. They just lie down and look up at the artwork. And for me, this is so suggestive of the way in which art, when you see it in reality, does something which art on a screen cannot do, which is the relationship of your own body, of your own presence to the presence of the artwork. We ourselves as bodies in front of the material object, that phenomenological experience, the relationship that we have of awe and wonder in front of something like this tapestry, or quite simply the sense not just of looking at the painting, but seeing that it's so big you have to move in order to see it, or that you come closer to it and you smell the wool. All these facets are really what make the visit to the museum so interesting and so different, you know, from looking at a book or watching a program on television, you know, or it's the fact that you're there. And of course, I think this is equally as important, the fact that you're there with others, that the experience of art in a museum is a social experience. It's a collective experience. And I think we need that, especially nowadays when we have so many experiences where we hold a small screen right in front of our eyes, and that's you know, our only contact. And of course, I'm saying this while we're in a Zoom call, and I think a Zoom call now enables us to do this. It enables us to talk about this, but it also enables us to say, actually, what's so important, Kamini, about your museum, what's so important about my museum, but all the museums and all the contacts we have with art is really that element of being present and of being there. You know, I think that's really important. Let me jump to, sorry.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we have time for one. Yeah, the last one. Okay, lovely.
Yes. This is now where the previous work was more than 6 meters tall. This work is this small. It's a tiny little painting. The tapestry was wool, a woven wool tapestry. This is a tiny painting, oil paint on a copper plate. It's a really ancient technique. It's a medieval technique, which gives the painting a tremendous luminosity. And it's a painting, the title is quite explicit, man and woman in front of a pile of excrements. It's a man and a woman arguing, debating. Miro painted it just before the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War. And it's a painting that for him represented the turmoil of the contemporary world that he engaged in. But it's also, I think, really interesting because of the way in which it does something which is really quite curious, that he gives both quite strong visibility to the sexuality of the two figures, but he makes both man and woman really, really strong. And I think that's one of the important things also, because when we take visitors into our museum, we want to also talk about many of the topics that are important today, which include questions around feminism, around gender identity, around LGBTQ identity. And all of these questions, curiously enough, can be explored also with reference to some of these key works in the in Miro's production. And really, the other thing about it is just beautiful. It's just a beautiful, delicate little painting. And for me, this is, I think, the last painting that I can talk about. So thank you. But I just hope that many of you will have the chance at some point to come to Barcelona and visit the foundation and see these works, the tiny ones and the huge ones in the flesh. But back to you, Kamini, and any further questions that we have.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so I think we have time for one last question before we throw it open to questions from the audience. And I really wanted to ask, the foundation has a special significance because of the kind of role Miro himself played, not just as an artist, but also as a sort of cultural mediator.
Yes.
He was a catalyst in connecting interests, in connecting personalities, in promoting a modern idiom, the private exhibitions he organized in his home. The role, for example, that he played with Alexander Calder's circus. You know, he put forth the idea of combining moving objects and drawings, which then Calder decided to use in his work. Do you want to talk a little about the significance it had in opening up Barcelona to the avant-garde and to ideas of modernity?
Oh, that is, thank you for that question. Really important, really, really important. When Miro created the Miro Foundation, originally the name of this was not the Miro Foundation. It was the Center for the Study of Contemporary Art. And when you come into the museum, over the entrance, you see the four letters CEAC, which in Catalan or Spanish means is the abbreviation for Center for the Study of Contemporary Art. And in tiny letters underneath, huge handwritten letters by Miro, in tiny printed letters, Miro Foundation. And for Miro, it was so important that this center would be a space for sharing new production, new cultural production, art, contemporary art, emerging art, music, theater, poetry, literature, everything. And in fact, this role that I sort of hinted at when I talked about the burned canvases, that he was looking at what other artists were doing, that continued throughout his life. He maintained this insatiable curiosity about what other people were doing, what other artists were doing, and he wanted to help young artists. Many people, for example, have asked, why did Miro not go into exile after the Spanish Civil War? Why did he stay in Spain under dictatorship when so many of his friends and colleagues went to the United States or to other places into exile? And Miro wanted to be here because this was where he was from. So he felt his origins very clearly. And also he wanted to share what he was doing with young artists. This in effect means that for young artists in Spain under the Franco years, under the Franco dictatorship, Miro was one of the very few international artists that they ever met. And so he had a really key role in promoting international art directly to this younger audience. And then when the Miro Foundation opened, it became really one of the first places in Spain where you could see exhibitions of international art. In this sense, it's really interesting that as we're preparing for the 50th anniversary, we've analyzed the history of our own exhibitions, and we found that 87% of the exhibitions we've done here in the foundation have not had anything to do with Joan Miro. They've been about other modern artists, young artists, emerging artists, contemporary artists. And so 87% of the artworks that we're showing here come from artists who are not Miro. And I think that is really important also to understanding the role we have. You know, it gives me a really wonderful chance here to, on the one hand, promote the work of Joan Miro, and on the other hand, to promote the importance of art and culture and creativity for our lives. And I think that's really the core in this. You know, Miro wanted people here in Barcelona, whether they're from Barcelona or visitors from abroad, to be in contact with art and culture and with the diversity and richness of human creativity.
I'm looking at a question here from one of our audience, and I'm wondering if you've already answered it. She says, as an institution that has had half a century of evolving, are there any learnings or insights that you could share on how the foundation has remained relevant or is working to stay relevant in a rapidly changing world?
Oh, fantastic. Absolutely. When we celebrate our 50th anniversary, on the one hand, we want to celebrate, as I said, the achievements of the first 50 years. But really, the main point is to think of this anniversary not as the conclusion, but as the beginning of our relationship with future audiences. So we want to make sure, we need to make sure that the foundation stays relevant to new audiences. So different ways in which we're doing that are quite simply through the work with artists, young artists, emerging artists, but also mid-career or more established artists. It doesn't matter, but what artists have to tell us about our world. And we use the capacity that artists have to show us our world through different eyes as a way of being relevant to the needs of our audiences. Our world feels, I'm not sure where that is, but it feels more complex, more hurried, more difficult than perhaps the world 50 years ago. And I think artists allow us to respond to and to negotiate the complexity and of our world, the doubts that we have in this world. So we want the art to speak for itself, but also for the art to be at the same time a tool that helps all of us to negotiate our place in the world.
Okay, very quickly, there's another question here which says, thank you for the wonderful conversation. What does it mean to show work like burnt canvases in the museum? How does the museum contextualize these works in relation to them also being a rebellion against and rejection of the economic and elitist frameworks within the contemporary art, which contemporary art tends often to operate?
This is spot on, this question is brilliant. Miro literally said that he wanted to assassinate painting. He wanted to assassinate, kill painting as a bourgeois practice. So he said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to burn and slash and destroy the canvas. It will not be useful as an object of speculation. Of course, we know that all artists who have tried to assassinate painting in this way have found that their artwork gets appropriated.
Even higher.
Yes, but for Miro, this clearly was part of what he was trying to do. Also, the fact that he was showing them not hanging against the wall, but hanging from the ceiling in the middle of the space. This is obviously something that it's very difficult to do in your living room, you know? And so that sense of the art world being present and physical is important. But what we also do to give a little bit of historical context to this work is that when we show it, we tend to show it with a beautiful film that was made while Miro was painting these works. And it's really, really fascinating to see Miro, this tiny little man, 81 years old, with a mop, moving the flames across the canvas, taking a knife and slashing the canvas, scissors and cutting through it. So his immensely physical engagement with the object, with the materiality, really helps understand what Miro was doing with that. And of course, we have in our own museum a little archive space in which we show more fragile material from the archive, including all these references to the other artists that Miro was thinking about or had at the back of his mind when he was doing these works. And really, it's a talking point. I think this is really important for us as well. When we show these works, they are always a key talking point for people who work with us in the galleries, who explain the works to audiences, or simply for our visitors as they walk around the spaces with their friends and other people.
Okay, I'd like to end actually with a question related to Catalonia, because I think our audiences need to know about that. Catalonia is a region that's very proud of its identity, its language, its culture. And you came in as well, the supposed outsider, but over the years, you have found a place in the heart of the Catalonians, perhaps first by speaking Catalan, which is a very emotive point for people.
Yes.
That's the role all good leaders are called to play on. And do you want to tell us a little about that journey?
I think that is, I mean, that's it's a personal question, but I think it's really relevant. I think without, you said how international artists are, but museum workers, we are also quite international. We met in London, you know, and so what I think, what it meant for me to come here from the beginning, I was absolutely clear that if there is a local language, I have to learn the local language. I can't work here and only speak English. Of course, I could speak English to my team. Everybody's highly educated. It would not have been a problem. But speaking the local language for my team, for everybody who works there, for all our visitors, but also for being able to live in the city in which I work, and to have a sensitivity to all the issues that arise in our quite politicized world. I think it was necessary to speak both Spanish and Catalan, and that really has proved immensely useful. You know, I think it helps me no end, and I think compared to all the wonderful challenges that come with being a museum worker, learning another language is child's play.
Well, I can say yes, a strong yes to that, Marco.
Yes.
But I have to say thank you so much for making the time to be with us on the Director's Cut and for answering all our questions with such thought, care, and consideration, and for giving us such a window into Miro's world and into the art world of Barcelona. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Kamini. Thank you for the invitation. It's been a real pleasure to take part in this project.
Thank you, and good night to you and all our viewers and our ISL interpreters for taking us through this program seamlessly. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, and good night.